Well, Shabbat Shalom for all of you who are joining us on YouTube. I'm excited to be here yet again to try to disseminate some information, bring some information to you about about our world, about our reality, and this today is no exception. So a couple things right off the bat that we would probably need to get into is the idea that if we were looking at the location and or the sighting of the new moon for the counting of the Omer, looking back to Passover time, and then the Sabbath after Passover. Of course, we interpret that as the Sabbath, the Saturday after Passover. So it could be a week from now, it could be a day after, or I'm a week after Passover, it could be a day after Passover. Passover could fall right on Sabbath, and so 7 days later we would have that first beginning, that first fruits offering, or the offering for the Bikurim, right? So the first fruits offering then begins the count of the Omer. And the count of the Omer has within it this process of moving from unleavened bread to leavened bread, and somehow moving from getting out the old leaven. So there's a couple things that have kind of happened in that thought process that we need to talk about. But in general, the way that I want you guys to think about this is that we kind of go through this um, time of accumulation. And I'll explain that a little bit more, but the premise is that we take upon ourselves junk, right? We take upon ourselves like these negative emotions, negative thoughts, and all this other stuff. Well, Passover is supposed to be a liberation or a deliverance from that limiting process. Okay. Remember, the premise is that there's actually a there's a release, or there's there's a removal from slavery, right? But that principle of slavery was actually service. Remember that, we the kind of where we're making a choice to be in the limitation, right? And remember that that Egypt is the limitation. Okay. So it's interesting because the way that this works then is that we need to understand that Shavuot, or the Feast of Pentecost, or the 50th day of the counting of Omer, begins a new season, ends a certain kind of season, and that certain kind of season has occurred in these past few months. So when we're discussing this, the premise or the idea is what I want you to think about is when we think about a season, we think about snow or sun or swimming or whatever. But the truth is, what a season is a cycle of time that repeats itself. Okay. A moedim is a cycle of time that repeats itself. It says, speak to the sons of Israel. These are the feast days, right? No, it says the moedim. These are the cycles of time that repeat themselves that the Israelites will keep every year. And then it starts with keeping the Sabbath holy every 7 days, right? And then it jumps into Passover, and then of course into the counting of the Omer, Passover, and then unleavened bread and Bikurim, or the Feast of First Fruits, and then right after that jumps into the Omer, unleavened bread, I'm sorry, the Omer, and then Shavuot or Pentecost, and then a long, long period into the Yom Teruah, Yom Kippur, Feast of Tabernacles, and the eighth day. And so, as a premise of these processes, the way that I want you to think about this is that each feast day is a cycle. Okay. What's the best way I could explain a cycle? Well, interestingly enough, the best way I can explain a cycle is to kind of use a process of what happens in a womb. Okay. And the reason why I want to explain it this way is because it can really help you understand what's actually happening in these cycles. Okay. Because remember, Paul said, everything that has been made tells us the invisible attributes of God, the divine power and his, or the eternal power and his divine nature. Now, I know I'm using English words there, and I know that is just a butchering of the reality of that verse. But what really is communicated, regardless of language, in that verse is what you see in nature is how God actually operates. And I know I just used the G word, but I am trying to bring in those who are not in the realm of Elohim understanding. Okay. So the way that I want you to think about this is that everything that exists within a womb exists for the purpose of the creation of life. There is no other process present. Okay. And so, this premise or thought process that there's some sort of curse upon the woman, and that there's this concept or this idea of that curse as a result of the cramps or the mood swings or all of those other things is just absolutely not the case. Okay. Because what's actually going on within a woman is a preparation for life. And that is not a curse. Life is never a curse. Okay. Death is a curse, right? Lack and decrease is a curse. So the way that I want you to kind of think about this in process is the idea that somewhere within the cycle of the moon, there is a cycle of the beginning of preparation for life. A space is created, and that space becomes filled with all of the things that are needed for a fertilized egg to begin the process of life. Because of the fact that there is a breaking down of systems and there's a change in the operation of cells, there's a necessity to keep that up to date. Okay. And as a result of that, there's a flushing that needs to occur. Now, you all women know exactly what I'm talking about, but what you don't realize is that that flushing is because there needs to be a new space created. So, what can we learn about the intensification of all power in the universe is that cycles flush systems. Okay. So let's talk about Passover for a minute. Let's jump over to the board and take a look at Passover. So when we're dealing with Passover, and I think the way that I'm going to go about this is just to do our general timeline that we already know, right? We know that there are 3 prescribed feasts in Torah, right? And we know that each one of those prescribed feasts contains the information necessary for that season. Okay. And so what's actually occurring during these prescribed feasts is very important. And so let's see. I think I'm just going to use that for that. And then we will, yeah, I think I'll probably just stick with, well, we could probably use a darker green there or something. Okay. All right. So at any rate, the way that I want you guys to think about this, let's go ahead and label these. Passover, Pentecost, That's a horrible A, but I think you guys get it. Tabernacles, which I have no idea. I have no idea why we call it tabernacles. So let's just get over that fact. Okay, so the premise is that Passover is this time of liberation, right? And so let's go ahead and label this with a different color, liberation, okay? This is the idea of going from dependence to independence, okay? Dependence to independence. And let's go ahead and label that a certain way. Let's say that we do this one. So this is, oops. This is going to be dependence. Now, if you wanted to think in terms of social interaction, dependence is where you view others as a resource and you believe that you cannot survive, exist, be validated, etc., without that resource. Now, don't get me wrong. I mean, we got all these love songs that talk about I can't live without you and all that kind of stuff. That's not what I'm necessarily talking about. I'm talking about more along the lines of basically exploitation. Now, before you go, wait a minute. Now, when I think of the word exploitation, I think of people who take advantage of people. Exactly. That's exactly what I'm talking about. But the problem is that people, we got to remember, you've got to remember, this world right now looks with these lenses. I'll change when they decide to change, right? I'm not going to do it on my own and waste my time, and nobody else is going to change. And not only that, but they'll say, it's actually their fault anyways, right? I'm not the problem. They're the problem. And so that from that point of view, then we say, well, okay, since I'm not the problem, I'm absolved of all guilt. I'm not responsible for what's going on, not in my backyard, and probably I don't really care what's going on. So in principle, what we're doing is we're saying we do not have that mechanism of responsiveness to a circumstance or conflict or problem that needs to be solved. I mean, this doesn't have to be negative. This can be the simplicity of a hurdle that we need to get over, right? Some sort of puzzle that needs to be solved, as it were. Okay. So I think it's important that in that process, we really kind of get our minds wrapped around this idea that dependence is exploitation. I know that you don't see yourself in that light. You need to start seeing yourself in that light. You are using people, period. Done. We don't need to prove it. You just need to admit it and change. Okay? So dependence is the first level, liberation from dependence, okay? The way that you want to think about this is being set free from the need to be depending on a specific entity to give you what you need. Now, in that process of dependence, we have the concept of everything happens to you, not for you, okay? And in that process of dependence, someone else has to tell you that you're a good person. Someone else has to tell you that you are capable. Someone else has to prove to you that you are able to do it. Okay? That's dependence. It's ineffective, and it is definitely not your potential. And it is definitely not the potential of humanity at large. Okay? We'll talk about that in a minute. So the premise is that dependence or liberation from and this is occurring during the Passover season, is going to bring you through a series of faults, okay? A series of faults or impurities that are going to manifest as a result of the wilderness season. Now, when I say manifest, what I mean is they're going to appear in your life as a result of what your heart actually contains. Okay? Now, if there's anybody who has not watched the last episode of the Renewing Your Mind series, which is part 1 of the Imagination mini-series, you need to go back and watch that. And the reason you do is because you will begin to understand what I mean when I am talking about that you're not born evil. We have things occur over time that create that malevolence. Okay, I'm gonna get to that. Don't get me wrong, there's an influence of malevolence, and we talked about that last week. However, it is very important for everybody to understand that you have the potential to do something amazing with your life. You have the potential to have, for lack of better words, amazing purpose, glorious purpose. But the premise is that in that you have to have a very different outlook on things, which is one of not needing that external validation and not needing that external locus of control. You don't need these things to control you or to keep you moving in a direction that is the will of somebody else. Okay? The premise is that in that process, the will of somebody else is actually causing you to move. What do I mean by that? I mean that there is a function where when people are in a state of dependence, they actually are indecisive and incapable of making their own decisions. But also, they want someone else to make the decisions because they don't want the responsibility if there's a failure in the structure, right? And then in addition to that, there is kind of this premise that if someone else makes the decision and there is a failure in the structure, it never falls back on you. So you just were doing what you're told. You do the Nuremberg defense. And so in context, that then comes to the idea that the word avodah or avod in the Hebrew actually doesn't mean slavery. So when it says, I led you by the hand out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery, you could actually interpret it as out of the house of servitude. I want you to recall the message where I talked about how the Israelites cried out to God. God heard their cry and delivered them, and that was a pattern that occurs later on in the book of Judges, which is indicative that the Israelites that were in Egypt during the time of the quote unquote slavery with the Pharaoh that took away the straw, etc., had the 10 plagues happen in his kingdom, were actually choosing to serve those gods. I know that that was a very controversial message because it indicates that the Israelites began their journey in Egypt in pagan idolatry, and that is what caused them to fall into oppression and eventually possession, where someone else had jurisdictional authority over them and they had no sovereignty to their decisions. Why would that happen? Well, if we were to accept the idea that we attract to ourselves what we want, then you could see where they would say, we do not want to make a decision. We're going to be indecisive. So we want someone else to make the decision for us, and that moves into possession. Okay? Because indecisiveness shows two very important things. First of all, it's a deception. It's a lie. Because the truth is we do have preference. We absolutely have preference. We have preference on flavors of food. We have preference on colors, everything, right? But we'll say, I don't really care. Or I'm not sure. You're sure. You just don't want to be sure because you don't want to get pigeonholed into a position. So that's one part of dependence that a lot of people don't realize. The second part of dependence is absolutely that part of exploitation. Quite literally, doesn't matter what you actually have an attitude about that person about, you still have an expectation, entitlement to be treated a certain way. That's dependence. Okay. And it taxes relationships. You overstay your welcome. You understay your servitude, right? You will go to something and receive all the benefits without any of a reciprocation, right? This is that idea of receiving without ever having an intention to give. That's dependence, right? So that is also something we should probably put on the board. We should probably put on the board that this is receiving without giving, right? Let's see, let's do a different color. And I know that red doesn't work, so let's do blue here with this pin. And let's see, we got yank. Okay, and so this one is going to be receiving, right? Without giving. Okay, that's dependence. So obviously, you guys could probably really easy conclude that Pentecost is going to move us into independence, right? Okay, yes, amen. And I will explain that a little bit, but we need to kind of get our minds wrapped around some energy stuff, right? So, what are we doing in a state of dependence? Well, we're activating our control dramas to steal people's energy, right? We're playing dumb, we're intimidating, we're manipulating, we are subjecting people to a lot of gossip and complaining to receive energy. And in that process of receiving that energy, we then are selfishly taking it in and having a vital existence as a result of stealing other people's energy. Now, there are people who are going to go, okay, I don't really believe in energy, or energy means that you're into witchcraft, or energy means you're a new ager, or energy means this. And I'm just going to say this way. Get off the channel. All right. So now that I've said that, anybody who's still left, here's the deal. You need to understand that that energy is a dynamic of your desire, okay? And desire is a dynamic of deficiency. Deficiency is a dynamic of a belief system about need, okay? Yeshua says, take no thought for what you will eat, what you will drink, what you will wear, for the heathen do this, right? And then he says, seek ye first the kingdom of heaven, all these things shall be added unto you. And then he says, look at Solomon, look at the birds, etc. Right? He's using examples from what? What has been made to explain God in his process of provision, protection, and instruction, which is inside the tent, right? Okay. So that function of process then needs to be one thought of that you will try to receive, because there's really a scarcity mentality. If I don't hoard this, if I save this and stock it up and keep it just in case, then when something bad happens, then we are actually going to be ready. Okay. That is the complete opposite of what Yeshua said, right? He said, take no thought for tomorrow, what you will eat, what you will drink, what you will wear. Okay. And so in premise, then we understand that there's a stinginess, or there is a withholding of giving when you are in a state of dependence. I will propose to you that one of the things that we can say about the Israelites in their process with Egypt is they were afraid. They were very fearful people. That attribute continues to manifest itself, continues to present itself, continues to be demonstrative of their heart, even when Yahweh actually carries out his promise. Not to them, but to Abraham, that he would bring his children into Abraham's promised land, as long as they were under the covenant of Abraham, which is circumcision. And if they were under the covenant of Abraham, which is circumcision, they could then enter the land and possess it and be inheritors of it. And I can tell you that land wasn't just a big old piece of dirt in the middle of the desert. That land had some sort of supernatural property to it that is very important to the vital process of reality itself. I'm not going to get into that, though. Are there other places on the earth like that? Sure. We could get into that someday, but not today. Now, having said all that, I think it's very, very important to then get our minds wrapped around what then are we going to encounter in the wilderness season. We are going to encounter a release from dependence and a movement towards independence. Okay, so liberation is the releasing. But then what needs to happen in that liberation? Well, it's kind of this way. If energy is neutral and the process of reality is actually neutral, and the function of natural order processes is neutral to your polarized mind, then we need to understand that when you come out of dependence and are liberated, you also have a tendency to be or feel or view yourself as no longer having any instruction or responsibility. Now, I know that sounds crazy, but the premise is that there's always a cost. There's always a cost to moving away from order. Okay. Now I get that Mitzrayim, right? The land of limitation, the land of Egypt, was not necessarily the order that they wanted to be in, because it was oppressive. It was tyrannical. But in the process of being liberated, there is an entitlement that occurs that says the rules no longer apply to me, period. Okay? So there's a side effect of liberation. And that side effect of liberation is actually kind of like a release of any responsibility. Okay? Which is where we don't want to be, right? So you want to be liberated from limitation, but you don't want to be liberated from limitation to the extent that you no longer have any governing process, because then you become disorder, or what the Greeks would call chaos. And so the premise is that in that whole function, when we're dealing with disorder, when we're dealing with randomness, we're dealing with dysfunction, it's the result of a release from limitations. And so in a weird sort of way, this is how it goes. You are governed. There is order. There is all these things that are going on that are keeping you in a very certain state, right? A binding. That's what Mitzrayim, or Egypt in the Hebrew, means. A binding, a wrapping around tightly, a binding of sheaves, right? A binding of a prisoner, right? So there's this premise of there being this order, but it's a binding agent. It's a, and I don't mean agent as in like glue. I mean a binding agent as in it is something that has authority over you, has jurisdictional authority over you. In other words, permission given by something higher than it to govern you, right? And then what? That is a closing in on. So then there's this premises that as you break forth and you come out, then there is a necessity for you to what? To open up and just start going in all directions without any limitation. However, the premise is that as that's occurring, there's a necessity to bring you back into order, not with that binding, but the principle is to bring you back into order because why? You can't stay in a disordered state. Now, here's the interesting thing about it. You can actually see this form of process present in religions that teach their participants that they have been set free from something. When you see a person who is a newborn Christian, they come in and immediately they're like, okay, I'm going to get the Bible. I'm going to stop cursing. I'm going to do all these things over here. And then immediately they jump into evangelism. In fact, there's absolute proof that a new Christian will evangelize more than a seasoned Christian by about 75%. In other words, there's a big difference between the seasoned Christian and the Christian who was just reborn. He's like, whoosh, goes off in all directions, right? Oh, I want to learn this. Oh, yeah, I don't believe that. Oh, yeah, you know what? That's a pagan over there. Oh, yeah, that's a New Ager over there. Oh, I can't smoke anymore. Up, right? So the premise is that there's this explosion of energy moving outward, right? But there's a necessity for that energy to be brought back into order in order for purpose to have its place. Okay. And so the process is that from Passover to Pentecost, or from Pesach to Shavuot, there is a cycle occurring. And there will be a flushing, right? Because why? There's a preparation for life. And this flushing is on a yearly cycle instead of a 30-day cycle, and is on a Pentecostal cycle instead of a 30-day cycle. In other words, it's 50 days. Okay. So I think there's a few things that are really important about this, because then what we can start to see is there's a necessity for energies to then what? Then to go from bound to liberation. And in that process of liberation, there's a releasing of limitations. Those limitations cease to govern the possessed, oppressed, infested, bound entity, right? Okay, so during the counting of Omer, we examine ourselves, whether we do the Neo-Judaic reading of Psalm 119, which never made a whole lot of sense to me, but we'll go with it. You read through it twice and then like 1/3 of it again. Whatever. If you're doing that as your meditation, or whatever you're doing, if you're doing the Kabbalistic following of the lower 7 Sifrot, or if you're just doing maybe Jesus calling, whatever you're doing during the counting of Omer, there's a self-examination by looking at the authentic. Remember, I have taught a counterfeit treasury agent whose job is to bust counterfeiters never trains by looking at counterfeit bills. They don't go, oh, yeah, here's evidence from one of our cases. You guys see how the owl actually has its head tweaked a little bit? That's fake. They don't do that. What they do is they go and they actually know, memorize, and understand every detail of the authentic. They examine the authentic in order to capture the counterfeit. They examine the authentic in order to know the counterfeit. They examine the authentic in order to what? To remove the counterfeit. So in principle, what we do is we examine some attribute of Yeshua. So there's this thing in the IBLP program that has the 49 attributes of Christ, I think it is, something like that. And quite literally is perfect for the counting of the Omer. What specifically is commanded is that you calculate the day. So how many days have we been into it? Oh, well, it's actually week 7, right? And it's actually day 49. We've counted that, right? Well, in that process, because today is week 7, day 49, as it were. But the premise is that however we look at it, what's important to understand is that there's some sort of examination of self going on. Well, did that happen to the Israelites? Yes, absolutely. They came into the wilderness and Yahweh let them go hungry. He let them thirst. He let them be attacked by Amalek. And all of those things led to an exposure of the heart of a belief about who they thought God really was. Brought us out in here into the wilderness to die of thirst, brought us out into the wilderness to die of hunger, brought us out in the wilderness to be killed by these marauders, right? That's the premise. So then now all of a sudden they get delivered. They have that whole thing where Moses is raising his hands and they're prevailing. And so Joshua beats Amalek, and then eventually that battle is over with. So they know that they were able to actually fight. That's that idea of going from dependence to independence. What did Yahweh do in Egypt? Brought all heaven and earth against Pharaoh, demonstrating that he absolutely could deliver them from an enemy. And then he lets Amalek attack. And who has to win? Joshua has to win, showing the Israelites that they could actually fight a battle, that they could learn war, that they could be independent of that dependence of deliverance. And then what? Manna and water from the rock. Answers to all the deficits, right? But in their brains, that is not what was going on. They did not believe that he actually was going to do those things until he did them. Okay, we'll leave that alone. But the premise is that as they come out of the land of Egypt, this place of bondage, they just blow wide open in the irresponsibility of their existence. I'm going to prove that to you in the thought process of the golden calf. Where did they ever get the idea that they could get away with it? I thought Torah was presented to them at Sinai, letting them know they should not be building a golden calf. Evidently, that's not the case. And evidently, what was said by Yahweh to the people of Israel in Exodus chapter 20, verses 1 through 18, because in verse 18, they're like, hey, whoa, don't be saying no more. Don't talk to us. We want Moses to go talk to us. And then Moses goes and talks to him. And then they're like, well, we don't know where Moses went. We're just going to do this. They were not willing to wait for the words of the covenant. They were not willing to what? Accept the gospel promise that they would be a holy nation, a kingdom of priests, and a peculiar people. And so in that process, then, they are now deciding that their identities that were offered to them by God are not enough, right? They've got to do their own thing. They've got to create a synthetic, right? And I've always, and I said in that Renewing Your Mind series, in the Imagination mini-series, part 1, that we actually don't believe that we're going to get what we want. Okay, we'll get to that. So what we need to understand then is as you're going through Passover, there's a preparation for life occurring, okay? And so you need to understand that at Passover, there's a flushing. And then there's a renewed lining within the vessel of reality for life to be given or offered, right? For a fertilized egg to enter the womb and begin its process of life. And so the way that I want you to think about Passover is a cycle, a washing, a flushing, okay? So at the beginning of the Passover season, the light of Passover goes out to the entire world, regardless. That's why it says those among you, the foreigners among you, the stranger among you, all have the same law. They have to do Passover this way, okay? Light of Passover goes out into the entire world, reminding the world that there was a point in time when there was no guarantee that you were going to live except that you were obedient to an instruction. Okay. Now, that premise doesn't equate to salvation. So please don't get that twisted for those Christian theologians who like to watch and critique me. In that process, though, one of the things that we do need to accept is the idea that there is a thing present that says, hey, during this season, you're going to experience cleansing through adversity. Adversity is going to expose the truth of your heart. You will say the words, God brought me out here to die. I wish I were dead. God hates me. God has forsaken me. God doesn't want me. Why doesn't God protect me? Why doesn't God deliver me? Why is there this injustice? Why is there this evil? Why is this? Why is that? Right? If Yeshua would have said, during the Passover season, take no thought for what you will wear, what you will drink, and what you will eat, maybe we would be a little bit more correctly responsive to the season, because it's literally trying to flush things out and purify you. Why would that need to occur? Well, here's the part that's really intriguing about this. There is a premise and a belief that in the world of height, width, depth, time, the world of formation, right, the Yetzirah, the world of Yetzirah, that there is this function of idea that once an inception and reception has occurred, that can never return to its original state of purity. And that's actually based upon the thought process or the idea that once a woman has had her marriage consummated, that proof, right, of, or that token of her virginity is done. It is, you can no longer say that she is a virgin, right? However, we don't see that process present necessarily in the philosophical and supernatural process of cleansing. What I mean by that is that there's a point in time where you move to a state of purity again. So there's a necessity of preparation for that thought process, and that state of purity also leads to what? To dependence. That state of purity also equates to something else completely, which is what? Instead of receiving without giving, which would be the concept in the reality of our time of contraceptives, right? Of preventing a pregnancy, as it were, right? That's receiving without giving. There is an inception, a reception, but no conception, right? And so the natural order process is interfered with, and therefore that's a state of dependence. Okay, so I think we've got enough information built into this now to functionally understand the cycle of Passover, the season of Passover. And so in times past, I've taught you guys that the season of Passover lasts this entire time, right? Season of Passover. And so now you understand that it's actually a cycle. It's a flushing. There's a preparation for life. And there is also a function of there being a preparation for the things that are going to happen at Pentecost. So the next thing we should probably do is go ahead and add these labels to the function of Pentecost. So if Passover is a liberation, then we know in general that, and in fact, what I'm going to do here is actually label this part first so that we can better understand what Pentecost is. And so we're going to go from dependence to, oh, wow, that was definitely not it. Dependence to independence. dependence to independence. Okay. And actually, I'm going to go ahead and match these colors up because colors in learning is very, very important. It affects your information, your DNA, all kinds of stuff. Okay, so in principle, then we should have that color going on for independence. Independence. You guys learn better when there's consistency, just so you know. Pendants. Okay, independence. Now, independence. Let's talk about that for a moment. So one of the things that's happening in independence is there's no longer a necessity for provision, protection, and instruction to be offered by the intensification of all power in the universe. Now, here's the intrigue here. The intrigue is that obviously in the grand scheme of things, that's why we give thanks, right? Everything comes down from the Father of Lights. All good things come down from the Father of Lights. And so there's this premise that there is still a provision, protection, and instruction, even when there isn't a provision, protection, and instruction. The proof in that is what? Your manna, your water from the rock. Okay. So then what we need to do is we need to understand independence in the sense of not necessarily self-preservation or self-providing, as it were, but instead moving into an understanding that you don't have to hoard and that there's enough for you and the next person, okay? Independence isn't necessarily about you stop receiving, but it is the idea that you receive and you don't try to hoard it. You start to try to offer it. Remember, your stomach can't get much bigger than it already is. And so you will consume your amount that you were given, right? But you still have more. Remember the idea of the 10 hamburgers, right? So I don't know, on a day when I'm hungry, I could probably eat 3 hamburgers, right? Not often. So that's still 7 hamburgers left over. What are you gonna do? Throw them away? You're gonna go give them to somebody. You're gonna provide someone else with food, right? That's the concept. So it doesn't matter how full you get, and that even in itself has this whole guilt and merit attached to it. You don't deserve it, et cetera, right? But the premise is that the other 7 hamburgers go and they get distributed. That is the word righteousness in the Hebrew, right? Sadiq. Okay, so independence is more about the idea. So it's not about, oh, now I'm going to provide for myself, right? Whereas before somebody was providing for me. That's not it. But independence is the idea that I can receive with the intention to give, right? And so the function is that I can receive with the intention to give because I'm going to receive, hold, and give, right? And I'm going to distribute after I myself have consumed. Now, here's the intrigue with this is the idea is that you're left alone in the wilderness to fend for yourself. How are we doing that? We're counting the Omer. We're seeing the authentic, proving the counterfeit in us, right? So we're seeing the authentic. We're looking into the actual potential of who we could be, seeing who we actually are, maybe experiencing shame, maybe experiencing cognitive dissonance, maybe experiencing incongruities. But in that process, we are what? Seeing what we could be. And then going, that's not who I am right now. I don't like that thing in me. Now, how we respond to that, it varies, right? Sometimes we respond by trying to create a false image, trying to present ourselves the way we would like to be seen or the way we would like to be known, even though we're not actually that thing. Some people might humble themselves and say, until I actually change and become the thing that I want to be, I don't want to, I don't want to present any image out there, right? Regardless of how you respond to it, the relevance is on the idea of now actually arriving at Pentecost. Because Pentecost is uh, uh, Pentecost is the actual moment of full extension of liberation. And Pentecost begins to put a band around dysfunction and disorder. How does that occur? Well, the premise is that the bride is in a state of willfulness, right? But at Pentecost, she becomes bound to the bridegroom. The consummation hasn't occurred yet. She's not the bride yet, right? She is the bride to be, but she now is been told, if you agree to the conditions of this covenant, then you will become my wife, right? You'll become my bride. But what does that look like in the energy realm? And the reason we need to ask that is because remember that I gave that teaching about John, the book of John, when Yeshua is with the woman at the well and says, God is spirit, right? Or Ruach. And in that teaching, we talked about the process of the idea that we're dealing with energies moving in a certain direction. So the way that I want you to think about this is that we need to ask, what is a marriage in energy, right? Well, interestingly enough, there's a couple ways that we could go about this. The first thing that we would need to do is we would need to understand dissonance, harmony, and resonance. Okay. And so the principle is that when we're dealing with a wave of sound, it's relatively linear. And I'm going to illustrate this on the board in a minute. And the reason why I'm going to illustrate it this way is because then you'll start to understand the difference between harmony and resonance. Okay. So the whole idea, and dissonance. So the whole idea is that if there is a wave vibrating at a certain frequency, a wave in space at a certain frequency, and another wave connects with it, and that wave has an opposite frequency, they cancel each other out. Okay, that's the principle. They reconcile to whatever the highest influence is in those, but the rest is canceled out. When a wave is actually in a situation where it is bound on both sides, in other words, there's a sender and then there's a reflector. When that wave comes back again and builds upon that same wave, that is resonance. That's an intensification of frequency. An intensification of frequency is still very much the same frequency, but there's more frequencies influencing it. Now, in that sense, it's important to understand that part of that has to do with the influence of frequencies. Whatever is the greatest or the highest frequency has a tendency to pull the other frequencies into resonance with it. Harmony is basically that same wave at a different interval. And so harmony is when 2 or 3 or 4 waves are actually interacting with each other, and they're all connected to that original frequency. The best way I could put it to you is, for example, when we have like when we have the Earth's magnetic field, right? And we have that Schumann resonance, there is basically a boundary of that magnetic field. And as those waves go out, they bounce back towards the Earth. And when they bounce back towards the Earth, they resonate, they create more intense frequency. You say, well, why would this be important? Well, here's what I want you to think about. Do we want to intensify, or do we want to come into alignment with a bride and bridegroom situation? In other words, do we want to increase the power or the authority of the groom, or do we want the harmony of the two authorities to interact with each other? Remember that Yahweh says to Adam in the garden, because you listened to the voice of your wife. Did Eve ever speak to Adam? No, she did not. She spoke to the serpent, right? And then she gives to her husband who was there with her, and he eats. Now, there's more to that dynamic, because remember, we're led away of our own lusts or our own desires. And Adam, when he ate, he sinned. Just as sin entered by one man, right, into the world. That's what Paul says, by one man, not one woman. So it's not until Adam eats the fruit that sin enters the world. Eve eating the fruit was not the function of sin. Maybe we'll speak on that someday, or maybe that'll come up in the Midrash. But the premise is that when Adam ate, he was listening to the voice of his wife. Well, that happens again with Abraham when Sarah says, go ahead and take Hagar. It says, Abraham listened to the voice of his wife. The wife's heart has an authority built into it that causes a movement of the man, okay? And so the wife influences the man with her authority, and he balances that out with his sovereignty of authority, right? And so the way that you want to think about this is you want to kind of be in alignment with the idea that what we need here is harmony. We need frequencies that are not exactly the same frequency intensifying, because then the groom gets exalted and is not in balance, or the bride gets exalted and is not in balance. We want harmony. We want separate frequencies that are resonating at the same intervals. Now, if you know music, you understand that harmony and intervals has to do with a specific mathematics of multiplication. In other words, harmonies are multiples of the original frequency, which means that when a bride comes into alignment with her groom, there will be a harmonious interaction of process. One frequency will not be exalted above another. Both frequencies will operate separate from each other, independent from each other. And in that process, they will still be in agreement. So when we're dealing with the intensification of all power in the universe, or we're dealing with the perceivable energy of that, right? Because when Yeshua is speaking of God, he's speaking of his Father, which is a very, very dialed back version of the intensification of all power in the universe, a perceivable God, right? Who we can assign attributes to of fatherhood, of groom, of some sort of connectivity of relationship. Now, when we are talking about that process here of independence, you now understand that there needs to be some sort of order brought to that frequency because that frequency needs to be harmonious. If it is an opposite frequency of either one of them, they cancel each other out. If it is one being exalted over the other just coming into a line with that frequency, it'll just be an intensity, right, of process. And so now we understand that independence is actually going to what? It's going to liberate a frequency from dissonance, but it's also going to liberate that frequency so that it can come in alignment with the harmonious function of a different frequency. Now, I know that probably was a lot to take in. But the short version of this is that if any one authority is given more precedence than the other, then there's going to be an intensification of it instead of there being a balance. Okay. Harmony and balance are relatively synonymous. There's obviously some differences between it. But in general, when we look at balance, we look at what would cause things to come into equilibrium. Remember, the entire Earth right now and its tectonic plate movements are all a result of hydrostatic equilibrium. You take a tube, you fill it with water, you put your thumb on one side, you put your thumb on the other side. No matter what you do with that tube of water, that water will stay in that one position. But if you were to actually let go of one side and raise the tube up, then the water would not move. But if you let go of it, the water's going to come shooting out the one side, trying to get back to the place where it is equal on both sides, regardless of whether the tube's there or not. The reason why that's important is because our bodies are doing the same thing with our chemicals, our hormones, our bioelectric processes, and of course, our biofield itself. Then also, of course, we have the function or process of the earth itself, the ecology itself, having a need for harmonious balance. If one species starts to become invasive or increasing more than another species, the ecosystem itself will make an adjustment and bring balance back. Now, in all of that process, you need to remember that we have a relative part of ourselves that is extremely authoritative to all of those other processes. We have a free will, and according to Psalm 8, everything that's created is below us in authority, below us in magnitude, below us in majesty, below us in priority. Everything that's been created, even those humongous stars in the sky exploding and doing really crazy astronomical phenomena. So in that whole process now, we understand that independence isn't necessarily being able to go off on your own and provide for yourself, but independence is more about starting to have the influence of other energies being a part of your process. Okay. In other words, there's that idea of coming from absolute order, going out into disorder, and then something coming along and trying to govern that back into order. Remember, the bride starts out willful. Remember, it's that premise of Yachal. In fact, let me go ahead and draw that really quick in order to just remind you, because I know it's been a while, and I think recapping is really, really important when you teach. So short version is that we have the word Yachal here, okay? And that means willful, okay? And then we have the word Kiyah, which means prisoner, or that which is bound. Okay. And then we have Li, which is a vessel prepared to receive. Okay. So we have willful, right? We have that which is bound, and then we have vessel. Then, if the yod then goes from a doing process to a beholding process, an observation, as it were, then we get kala, which is bride. Okay. So when we go from an action to an observation, then we become the bride. And this is not necessarily a cycle. Unless you view it from the point of view that we are always moving to a higher bridehood, meaning that we would start in some sort of willfulness. I could go with that for sure. All right. So from that, then you understand the process of the responsibility of the bride. She needs to first surrender her will. Well, that happens at the betrothal. So there's a moment in time when the bridegroom proposes the covenant. He says, "This is what I will do. I will not cease food, clothing, or conjugal rights from you. I will provide for you. I will protect you. I will be your man, and you will be my wife." And she has one simple task: to surrender her willfulness. And in that process of surrendering her willfulness, she is offered a cup. And if she takes that cup and drinks that cup, then she actually will move into the bound state. Why? Because now she is betrothed. Okay. And as she moves from the bound state into the humble state, so there's that time when she's struggling, trying to pull her hands apart, as it were. And just so you know, the reason I'm doing this is because that yod is actually a hand. So it's out here by itself doing its thing. It's brought into alignment here, right? It's brought into order here between what? Between what's the kaf? It's the conforming palm. It's the palm that will wrap around something. And it means to conform. And what's the lamed? The authority. So it's literally that hand conforms to authority. Prisoner. Makes sense, right? But then she moves to what? A state in which the conformity and authority are actually to the right hand or to the place of honor. And that's when she's a vessel of reception, ready to become a bride. In which case, then we start to get into the Feast of Tabernacles, and we're not there yet. Okay, so the function is what? Going from the willfulness here, where she's at the right hand or the place of honor, and the conformity and authority are completely separate from her process, to coming into alignment here. Okay. Now, in that process, then we're moving what? Towards the idea of her becoming a vessel of reception, ready for what? Inception, which is the consummation of the marriage, which is going to change her from what? From a doer to a beholder. We'll get into that a little bit. Okay, so now you understand and you can see that how that function or that process occurs. Let's get back to now our list. Okay, so what have we learned then? We've got this idea of liberation, and then we've got this idea of betrothal, right? Or we've got this idea of a binding or a re-governing of those energies that have gone out in every direction, as it were. So what's interesting about this receiving without giving is when we get into the thought process of Pentecost, we are going to receive with intention to give. Okay, so this is receive, to, give. Okay, so independence will obviously also bring us into a state of the actual abundance mentality, that there is actually something for everyone. There's enough for everyone. Okay. Now, in that function of liberation, we also understand that that's actually going to turn into a willfulness that needs to be surrendered at Pentecost. Okay. And so the season of Passover creates a willfulness. That willfulness isn't necessarily positively or negatively charged. It's not good or evil, but it can definitely present itself as any of those things. So one of the things then that we need to get our minds wrapped around is that liberation then comes to betrothal, which is a proposal of order, an offer of order. Okay. Then that then results. And what is the purpose behind this? Let's talk about this a little bit scientifically for a moment. In a reductionist philosophy, you are reducing humans down to their scientific processes. You're reducing humans down to their anthropological, civilized existences. You are reducing them down to their species and their actions within those species. We, being sapiens, as it were, have some attributes that are very specific to that type of animal. However, as mammals, we have some other things built in. And that's not what makes you human. That is not what makes you different from those other species, not what makes you the superior species. So then let's talk a minute about, say, the biological function of bonding. Okay. So the biological function of bonding, or the intention behind it, was to create a mate that will not eat the offspring, that will protect the offspring. All right. So the premise is that by there being a release and an intensification of oxytocin, a bonding occurs between the male and the female. So what does that do? Well, number one, that makes it so that there is an exclusivity, that there is almost a monogamousness to the process. In fact, it is a violation of natural order processes that there be polyamory within the function of oxytocin. Now, don't get me wrong, because there is definitely an idea that there can be more than one propagation. In other words, a man can impregnate more than one female. And since we're operating at the reductionist level, we can't get into emotional attachments of cheating and all that other stuff. We need to stick with the science here for a minute, because the thought process here is that every single time a male impregnates a female, there's going to be a bonding so that that male protects that offspring and doesn't eat it himself. That's the premise. And so the whole idea is that bonding occurs as a result of the idea that there needs to be a protection of the next generation until the next generation can mature. Okay. So in principle, then, the way that we can look at this is that the greater is actually bonding with the lesser in order for there to be a protection, in order long enough for there to be a new creation occur. Okay. And then once that occurs, then that cycle starts back over again. And this is where we get into the concept of a relationship with God or a relationship with Christ, right? Okay. And so now you understand that as energies and processes of harmony and all those other things, there's an intention to create a new energy. There's an intention to create new life. There's an intention to have something new occur. Okay. And so that then becomes important because why? Because tomorrow, if we're looking at the astronomical calendar, we are saying that tomorrow is Pentecost according to the eye of the beholder, and that tomorrow is the actual function of betrothal and end of the wilderness season and a beginning of the golden calf season, which we're not ready to get into yet. But the premise is that there is an intention of collapsing starting to occur upon these free energies or this free spirit, this woman who's come of age and she just wants to take on the world. And now all of a sudden, here comes a bridegroom stealing her heart and her now going, oh, wow, I have to let go of that willfulness and come into order. This is not the idea of the caveman going and bonking his future wife on the head and grabbing her by the hair and dragging her back to the cave. This is a concept of disorder coming into order for there to be a greater liberation, as it were. I know that can sound really, really confusing, but the premise is that there's an ebb and flow of liberation, and there's an ebb and flow of order, and there's an ebb and flow of covenant, as it were. Why? Because we're still human and we still pick up on those malevolent energies that are present in this 99% darkness. And that is going to become very important in this process. Okay, so what do we understand then about independence is that it is full of a willfulness that needs to be brought into harmony. Okay. So then let's look at the Feast of Tabernacles then. If liberation is the idea of a releasing of energies that have been bound as the result of there being a tyrannical or oppressive spirit, this could be wounds, limiting beliefs, entitlements. Now there's a liberation from it. It's going to be taken to the extreme, right? It's going to be taken to the extreme and then brought into order. And when it's taken to the extreme, I mean, this is an example of the person who first learns about Torah, about the absolute anti-Semitic nature of the church during the Council of Nicaea and all those other things, and goes, what? Gets angry, is like, what have I been doing? I have been learning this junk and I want to learn the truth, right? And so they get angry and they become what's called a Torah terrorist, where they demand that Christians stop eating pork. And they don't understand that they were eating pork a week ago. They forgot about that part. They're more interested in what everybody else is doing, right? Okay, so that's the premise of there being a need for that explosion outward to be brought into order. And then there will be another liberation, as it were. And I'll explain that in a minute, because we'll start to see this amazing cyclical process occur, which is really something else. You can bank on one thing. Every cyclical process is designed to flush the old out, to bring in the new, in order to give a space for a new thing. Okay? All right. So the process that we need to get into here is now going to be that what we need to understand is that if this is the betrothal here, then we need to accept that this is the consummation. right? This is the yod turning into a hay and her going from a vessel to a bride. Consummation. And so now when we get into that part, now what we need to do is we need to say this is going to be interdependence. Right? And then what we're going to see is that now there is a function of, and this is powerful right here, giving to receive. I spelled that wrong. When we're talking about giving to receive, the way that you want to think about this is that you now understand the purpose behind receiving. So that's one thing that I think a lot of people don't completely understand, is that it's okay to tithe, to give gifts, whatever, in order to receive more abundance, because you will have learned the function of abundance within the Pentecostal season, which I'm going to explain in a minute. The function of abundance is you get as full as you want to get, right? Full to the top. Like no more, can't eat anymore, starting to get fat, probably don't really want what you had before. And then you begin to squander the abundance. You do not actually do with the abundance what you're supposed to do. And we're going to get to that. But the premise is what we're coming into tomorrow is the Pentecostal season. Okay. So now the next thing that we need to do here is we need to look at the process or the function of the season of Pentecost. So let's go ahead and take a look at that. So this is the season of Pentecost. Now, what's going to happen during that season? I want you to recall, and let's go ahead and put this in, we'll put this in green. I want you to recall that there is a spiritual incline and decline that occurs. And I want you to recall that there is a physical decline and incline that occurs. And then that physical is going to increase and decrease. And the spiritual is going to increase or decrease and increase. Okay. And I want you to know that this upswing right here is prosperity. Okay. From the halfway point of the Omer, there will be an upswing in physical prosperity. Now, I'm just going to tell you right now, that does not have to be money and may not be money. So don't get in your head that Q's teaching that after that halfway point of the wilderness season, you're going to get rich. That's not what I'm teaching. Because the physical increase could be an improvement in health. It could be a return of a loved one into your life that hasn't been there before, etc. Okay. So don't get in your brain that I'm saying that abundance and increase necessarily has to be monetary. Okay. So you notice there's a downswing in spiritual energies, right? There's that halfway point, there's a downswing in spiritual energies, and that downswing is basically going to be not necessarily an idea of lack and decrease in the realm of energy, because you could very much need that energy to heal somebody during the season of the golden calf. But there is definitely an upplay in physical manifestation of um, abundance, and there's a downswing in spiritual manifestation of abundance. Okay. All right, so the premise is then what we have going on as we go from the season of Passover into the season of Pentecost is we'll start to see that there is going to be a new order presented to this energy. You can see that the energy of the physical abundance realm is actually going to come into order by increasing, and the order that is being brought into, or the energy that's being brought into order in the supernatural realm is all coming to order at that point at Pentecost. There's a choke point, as it were, there. There's a collar, as it were, put upon those energies. Okay. Passover season ends with that last day of counting of the Omer, which is today, and that is Malkut of Malkut. Everything has transcended, or I'm sorry, everything has descended into a physical process, gone from an uber spiritual process into a physical process. Malkut of Malkut is absolutely about being totally grounded, right? Completely centered, completely pure, and ready to have that proposal given to you, right? The bride has made herself ready, right? Okay, so the premise is now that betrothal has occurred. Now, it is very important to understand that betrothal is not the consummation of the marriage. Betrothal is the offer of joining. And then the joining occurs as an agreement, okay? An acceptance of reception, as it were, yes. In the sense or understanding that, yes, I'm willing to come into order, right? And so at Pentecost, one of the things that we do is we open up the scroll, we have people hold it, people go inside the scroll and spin around and agree to what? To the betrothal. They turn in the belief that they're going around 3 times, and they are accepting or as it were, vowing to what? Honor this covenant. But the next thing that happens after the betrothal is the groom, which we're going to illustrate in orange here, drops out of the picture. Why? What is the groom doing? Where is he going? He is actually moving on. Let me show you that real quick. Okay, there we go. The groom is actually going to what? Make a space for the bride. He goes to prepare a place. And there's a higher governing authority, or a greater, that is in control of the timing of that function. And during that season, what happens? Well, the bride falls asleep, right? The bride falls asleep. What does that mean? That means that she loses conscious connection with the groom. In other words, she moves back into a state of independence. But this is a new kind of independence, because now there's what? Abundance. Abundance is present, and therefore, since abundance is present, then all of a sudden, she now has a stewardship or responsibility. That stewardship or responsibility comes in the form of her having to maintain her function of the covenant without consummation. She has to play bride or declare herself taken. So how does that equate to the world of energies? Well, the premise is that she has to come into the idea of harmony and start to resonate at the same frequency as the groom, right? But not that specific frequency, some a multiplier of it, right? And her and the groom together will create a new frequency. We haven't gotten there yet. But the premise is that then what we have going on is we have this idea that she will be in order regardless of the consummation, which means she has to spend some time here. She has to spend some time not being willful. It doesn't stay that way because why? Because there's only one element in which there is a necessity for submission. And I'll get to that. But the premise is that as she is going through that process, abundance has been given to her. She now has the entire function of inheritance present in that process. And that whole idea is the transition from the inheritance that she had with her father to the inheritance that she has with her husband. Remember, Eve had jurisdictional authority over the garden that she transferred authorship or leadership to the serpent. Remember, the serpent gets jurisdiction through Eve, and Adam, instead of realigning Eve into her state and taking that jurisdiction away, says he agrees to it and allows it to finally come into fruition, right? And through one man's sin entered the world. Okay, so the premise is then now what we have is we have this function of the bridegroom leaving, and the bride now has the responsibility to honor the covenantal process, right? In fact, if she was right now to go after another man, it would be considered a violation of that covenant. So when we look at that process, then we start to understand that now that disorder is coming into order again, but now a new independence or liberation has occurred. And so here's the intrigue of this whole thing. The betrothal provides yet a new, let me go to my color here. Liberation. A different kind of liberation, right? A liberation from what? From the oppressiveness of the wilderness season, right? Put this down here. The oppressiveness of the wilderness season, the hardships of the wilderness season, the hunger, right? Remember this whole thing. In fact, I'm going to label this. Let's see, we'll just go ahead and use this here. Hunger. Okay. And we'll label this satiety. Right? Satiety. Satisfaction. No longer hunger. The opposite of hunger. And what's going to happen? I'm just going to put this in parentheses here. And what does Deuteronomy 32 say? That Yeshurun grew fat and sleek and kicked, became willful again, right? Grew fat and sleek and kicked, became willful, and went after gods that their fathers had not known. An evolution of idolatry. Went after gods that their fathers had not known, who are not gods but demons, because what? There's this new jurisdiction being granted to malevolent energies to create a correction and a balance, right? It is a what kind of people? A not hungry people who go after other gods. A hungry people will never go after another god. Okay? And so the premise is then what we have satiety, but then there's the potential for fatness if you don't step into the abundance cycle. Remember, the cycle of Israel has the one side where you drop into obedience that creates infestation. Infestation turns into oppression. Oppression turns into possession. There's a crying out, a deliverance. There is a repentance, a death, and a resurrection, and new life, and an adherence to Torah again, adherence to obedience again, which then gives the opportunity to enter back into the abundance cycle. Remember, the abundance cycle has a time of rest. Remember, the abundance cycle has a time of sowing and reaping. You got to remember that. But the premise is that in that you can keep from becoming fat. When you are full, you distribute. Simple. The fullness is the proof that the abundance was real as a result of the obedience and the willingness to sow in the first place. But you need to turn around and sow again. That's the abundance cycle. All right. So now we notice that there's a liberation that occurs at Pentecost, a new allowance given to the bride to be willful, right? And in that process, she can either move into the cycle of abundance or she can move into the cycle of disobedience. If she moves into the cycle of disobedience, there is definitely a decrease coming, right? There's a decrease coming. Now, if you distribute wealth, there's a decrease in your bank account, right? And that's where that trust comes. That's where that necessity to step back into order comes, etc. Meaning what? Meaning that there is actually, at the time of consummation, yet what? A betrothal. You say, well, wait a minute, Q, you're confusing things. If there's a betrothal, I need to write that in purple, actually. But you say, wait a minute, Q, if there's a betrothal at the consummation, then it's not really the consummation. Well, you're still not necessarily understanding the cycle here, because what I'm showing you is that each one contains each attribute. Okay, so at the Feast of Tabernacles, there's another order, which means there'll be what? Another liberation. And what is that liberation at the Feast of Tabernacles? What happens after the Feast of Tabernacles? What do we enter into? What was the Feast of Tabernacles? It was the last harvest, right? It was the fall harvest. Now it's time to what? Sow. We enter into the sowing season, and then the growing season, and the maturation, and then the harvest again, which starts us back in the feast day cycle again. We leave Tabernacles on the 8th day with an understanding that we are not going to harvest again until we get to what? We get to Passover. And in that process, now we have that function of what? We have that idea that you're supposed to be sowing and then waiting. And that's a whole nother beast that we won't even get into that teaching probably until Tabernacles, until Sukkot. But for Shavuot, we have again a liberation. And so now you see that not only is there a liberation at Pentecost, but there is also a consummation at Pentecost. A spiritual consummation, physical consummation, not necessarily relevant per se, but an understanding that all three attributes are present at Pentecost. There's an opportunity to go outward and be effective, right? To be a bride who's in order, who's what? Already been connected in with the Father, and who is in that process of harmonious interaction. Okay. So now there are a number of things that we need to get into, because you thought that that was the end of the message. But the truth is that was preparation for this part, because this part is the part that actually will create the function of potential and eventual realization of what we're talking about. So what we need to do is we need to understand the word Ruach in a more effective sense. Okay. So let's talk about first what is the proposition that is actually occurring in Christianity right now concerning Pentecost? What do they believe happened versus what actually happened? And what do they understand about it versus what actually is the knowledge that needs to be understood? Well, first and foremost, one of the things that you would probably agree with me is that this was a correction. We've talked about that. That at Pentecost, 3,000 were baptized, and at Pentecost or at Shavuot in the wilderness at Sinai, after the golden calf, 3,000 died. And there was a correction there. There was a repair. In fact, you can go back and watch the video is very early. It's probably like 2021, probably December of 2021. I think it was like New Year's Eve of 2021, pagan New Year's Eve, that actually I spoke the message about Tikkun Olam, which is correction, right? Okay, but even though that's true, there's a number of other things that play a role here, right? Supposedly they receive the Holy Spirit in the sense that there was not a Holy Spirit. But yet at the same time, we understand that there is a spirit of life present in human beings that seems to expire when the flood comes, which means what? All flesh died. Humans died, right? And we have that DNA signature in our epigenetics that says there's this bottleneck where only about 8 people existed on the earth. Okay. Huge population down to a bottleneck, and then huge population back out. So the reason why this is so important is because we understand that there is something that causes us to exist, be alive. Now, if we accept it from a reductionist point of view, that's adenosine triphosphate, right? That's the energy of life. A cell is able to oscillate one single more time because of one burning of adenosine triphosphate, and therefore the cell goes on to do what it does one more time. And then we have the function that if adenosine triphosphate is not present, then that cell will not oscillate again and it will die. Okay. But the premise is that that's the reductionist side of this thing. Let's go with the actual spiritual side of this thing, which says that the intensification of all power in the universe and all the information present within it and all the power present within it is actually within us, only gone through a series of transformers to bring us down to the level that we're at. So a dialed back version of the exact thing itself, an actual Elohim, an actual intensification of all power in the universe dialed back. That's what the teaching was last week. And so the premise is then what we understand is that there is no filling of the Holy Spirit per se, but instead an intensifying. And where we may have that breakdown is in the Greek, because remember the Greek is a copy of a copy, which is a copy of a translation, right? Hebrew to Aramaic to Greek. Why? Because of the transition of regional connection to the original speakers or authors of those books. So when we get into this thought process, then what we need to kind of accept is that if there's a spirit already present in us and the Holy Spirit comes, is there a separation between who those two are? Well, not if you accept that we are the intensification of all power in the universe dialed back. If we accept that, we understand that all that happened at Pentecost was an intensification of that energy already present within them, a resonance, a moving back and forth of waves at a higher frequency. Okay. And so in that sense, we now understand then that Pentecost is about a time of something new something new being prepared. Now, just like at Passover, where there was a spilling out and then a releasing, right? And now there's a new lining in the womb being created. So also at Pentecost, there's a spilling out and releasing, and a new lining is being created for what? For the fall feasts. Because the fall feasts are going to lead up to what? A confirmation of the covenant, a reconfirmation of the covenant, I should say, and then a consummation, which is tabernacles, which is the third prescribed feast. Remember, there are 3 prescribed feasts in which no man will show themselves present empty-handed in the place where Yahweh would put his name. Okay, and so the function or dysfunction of this is going to come in the form of willfulness. Willfulness to distribute. And remember, we're dealing with the chesed side, right? We're dealing with the mercy side, or the giving to a fault side, versus the consuming and giving nothing side, which causes a new what? Dependence. And so where we would have independence occurring at Pentecost, we would enter into a new dependence. And so in its intrigue, there's this cyclical process present within a cyclical process, which makes sense because somewhere along the lines, we have to accept the macrocosmic versus the microcosmic versus the really small microcosmic, where the macrocosmic becomes the microcosmic again, vice versa. And so in that process, we need to accept that there is a need to understand the Ruach differently, because the Ruach is a part of this process at Pentecost. Remember, Yeshua said, you will be endowed from power on high. I'm sorry, endowed with power from on high. Horrible King James translation of God knows what it was written in the Hebrew, but I can tell you in its simplicity, what Yeshua was saying is y'all are about to get something new, something amazing. There's going to be an inception, and there's going to be a conception, and there's going to be a growing, right? There's going to be a outward expansion or intensification of what? All power in the universe dialed back. And so in that way, we should probably try to understand the Ruach better, okay? Now, I know that we started late and that we're going late, but I think this is a very important attribute of Pentecost, because it says that the Spirit was given at Pentecost. And I want you to understand there was already a Spirit present in humans, but it was limited. It was not liberated. At Pentecost, it was liberated. Okay. So having said that, we probably need to examine, we'll go ahead and we'll get ourselves a new whiteboard, and we need to examine this word Ruach. Okay. So what I'm going to go ahead and do is I'm going to go into Acts chapter 2, and we're going to kind of just work our way back, right? I'm going to show you how it goes from the Greek to the Hebrew really quick, and go from there. So let me go ahead and hook up this HDMI cable for my tablet. And we will technical difficulties here. Give me 1 second. Gotta love technology in so many different types of ways. Love to hate it, love to use it, would love to not have anything to do with it. Okay, so let's see here. Oh, that's interesting. Okay, well, I guess we're gonna have to use the board for this because my tablet's just not working at all, which that's fine. We can do that. All right, so then let's see, we'll jump over to the board and I'm just gonna go here and let's see, let's go Blue Letter Bible. Okay, and then we'll go to we're gonna go to Acts. Okay, and then we will jump over to chapter 2. And when the day of Pentecost was fully come, what is Pentecost? That's that 50th day, right? That's that 50th day of the counting of the Omer. Was fully come, they were all with one accord and one place. We'll go ahead and just leave that how it is and leave it in the King James Version. And suddenly there came a sound from heaven as of a rushing mighty wind, and it filled all the house where they were sitting, and appeared unto them cloven tongues like of fire that sat upon each of them, and they were filled with the Holy Ghost. So let's go to that word Holy Ghost right there. Let's go Tools, and we're going to jump over to Interlinear, and we're going to jump over to this word Holy Ghost right here. Pneuma. Okay. And if we look at pneuma and we go into the when we go into the information in the Thayers, we will see that it is the word Ruach. Okay. And the word Ruach is Hebrew. We go into our Hebrew word here, and we can see that it is wind, breath, mind, vein, air, anger, cool, courage. Okay. Well, that's nice, right? Well, that works. We have an understanding that we got it back to the Hebrew, right? And if you look, the first usage of the word is actually Genesis 1:2. And the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. Okay, so now let's go back to our whiteboard. And what we'll go ahead and do is we will, let me see, I want to do this in, let's do this in purple. So this is the word Ruach. Now, there's a couple things that are kind of important about it. The first one is obviously it contains a yod, it contains a hey, it contains a vav, it contains an aleph, or it contains a doubled last letter, which will represent with X's. Put a comma there so the aleph and the X's are not confused. This equates to a child root, which means we can trace the parent root. Well, it contains a yod, it contains a vav. So we can drop the vav, and then we can look at this from the point of view of a parent root, which of course is what? It is the drawing of a human head, right? That's the chesh. And this is no resemblance of anybody you know, I promise. And then this is what? This is the drawing of a tent wall. Now, since I'm still having struggles with my tablet, I'm going to go ahead and read you the definition, but I can't actually show it to you on the screen. But what we're going to do is we're going to pull up that Strong's Concordance number. So jumping back over to the internet for just a moment, we can see that the Strong's Concordance number being used there is actually H73 or 7307, right? And so I'm going to go into my lexicon, and we'll just go back to the board for now. I'm going to go into my lexicon, and I'm going to read you the definition. Like I said, I apologize. I can't pull up the tablet today. Some crazy madness going on. So this was 7307. Okay. And so when we're talking about Ruach, we're going back to the parent root of the word. And this is what it says. The pictograph, and let me just do it this way. The pictograph, which we will circle this in orange so that you can follow along. The pictograph right here, is a picture of the head of a man. And the het, right here, is the picture of a wall that separates the inside from the outside. Combined, these mean man outside. Okay, so what does that mean? Well, first of all, obviously, when we're dealing with man outside, we're talking about outside the tent. Remember, the tent is the symbol of the functional process of the clan in their existence with each other. The tent represents family. The tent represents provision, protection, and instruction. The tent represents repentance. The tent represents safety. In the sense of that a person should take refuge there. If they're returning to the tent, one of the repentances they need to have is taking refuge or trust, right? And then what? They have provision. Here we go with abundance, right? You have to step into abundance. And then there's the premise of instruction, which means you need to be obedient to instruction. A shuv or teshuvah is moving back to instruction, moving back to provision, moving back to protection. Okay? Now let me read you the ancient Hebrew nomadic understanding of this pictograph. The responsibilities of the nomad outside of the tent include feeding, watering, caring for livestock. Livestock are healthier and more productive when on a routine. Therefore, the man follows a routine or a prescribed path each day when caring for livestock. Why is this important? Because the word for wind in Hebrew is ruach. So what is ruach? It's a prescribed path. Okay. So if ruach is a prescribed path, then we have a very, very different understanding of what happened at Pentecost. I want you to think about what prescription means, okay? Let's say that I pull up the etymological dictionary on my tablet here. Of course, again, I can't share it with you, but the premise is that I can pull up this dictionary and tell you what prescribed means. However, right off the bat, we're going to see that it's prescribed, right? Prescribed, Presc. So prescribed is mid-15th century prescriben, to write down as a direction, law, or rule. From the Latin prescribere, right before. The prefix in writing or ordain, determine in advance, right? So from before, pre, and from scribere, to write. From the Proto-English root scribe, to cut, right? To cut through clay. Prescribed or prescribing in a medical sense. So what do we got? We've got to give instruction before. Before what? Before an action. To give instruction before an action or write down as a direction, right? To write before an action occurs. Why is that important? Because now what we understand is that what happened at Pentecost is they were given instruction. What instruction were they given? Remember, these are not Gentiles. These are Jews. Jews in Jerusalem during one of the prescribed feasts, right? One of the feasts where no man was to be empty-handed, and everyone had to show up, right? Everyone had to show up at Pentecost. So you had Passover, then 50 days later, you went straight back to Jerusalem for Pentecost. And then, a good 80 days later, you went back to Jerusalem again for what? For Feast of Tabernacles. And so these three feasts required everybody to be there. And what? At that Feast of Pentecost, people were given an instruction. But that instruction was a path. And there is in the Hebrew understanding an idea of path in the sense Noah walked with God, right? Enoch walked with God. David walked with God. Solomon walked with God, etc., etc., etc. There is a movement of, or there is a image that is metaphorical of moving down a trail towards a goal, going from a source to a goal, going from an origin to the place instructed to go or the place desired to go. So in principle, then, Ruach is the idea of what? Purpose. I propose to you that what they were actually given at the Feast of Pentecost after Yeshua's death, burial, resurrection, and ascension was purpose. They were given the actual instruction to go in a certain direction. That certain direction had some sort of connection to frequency, vibration, sound, right? There was some sort of voicings occurring during that moment, sounds that sounded as it were like a mighty rushing wind. As it were means it was not a mighty rushing wind. Okay? As is apocalyptic speech. Apocalyptic speech gives pictures to try to explain the unknown. Okay? That's what it does. It's an illumination or a construct created to tell you what it is they think they see or hear or feel, right? Okay, so why is this so important? Because now what we need to do is say, if we are given a prescribed path, if there is a determined direction that you're supposed to go, that is your purpose, then you need to understand that if we are looking at Pentecost from the point of view of the beginning of an abundance that could result in fatness or is going to result in you going into the abundance cycle, you are going to what? Be enabled financially, mentally, physically, emotionally, okay, spiritually. You are going to have everything that it takes to do that thing. That's the power behind Ruach. So the next time you say, oh, the Holy Spirit told me to do this. No, it didn't. Something else is the actual power behind it all. And the Holy Spirit is just a direction you're supposed to go. Why is this so important? Well, A, we need to understand that it's a new willfulness. The groom yet again pulls back, but this time doesn't pull back and leave you hungry, unprotected, and thirsty, but overly hydrated, overly and abundantly fed, and uber protected. Let's see what you do with abundance. I see what you do with scarcity. Let's see what you do with abundance. It's almost another counting of the Omer. In fact, right before the, Yom Kippur, during the 10 days of awe, we're in a state of examination, but 40 days before Yom Kippur, at the first of the 6th month, a relevant number, because why? 6 in general means that something is missing in the realm of supernatural. You are lacking something from the spirit. Okay. So the number 6 is indicative that some change needs to occur in the supernatural realm. An energy change needs to occur. But then we're moving into the 7th month, which is what? A completion of promise, right? The number 7 is a completion of promise. But as we're moving into the 7th month, those last 10 days are a deep introspection. So is it the counting of the Omer again? No, we're not going through and looking at the authentic in order to fix the counterfeit. We're going through to examine what we need to absolve ourselves of through the merit of Yeshua at Yom Kippur. How do we return to our identity as the righteousness of God? We need to shed those things, teshuvah, head back towards the tent, head back towards provision, protection, and instruction. Why? Because we probably squandered everything and we're eating pig pots. We probably blew the whole entire stack of cash, right? And we're eating pig pots. Because instead of moving into abundance and doing the equal distribution of wealth after we've consumed, we squander the inheritance. That's the function of the bride falling asleep. Now, here's the interesting thing. When we talk about the 10 virgins, right? And we talk about how they fell asleep, we think the 5 actually are the only ones that fell asleep, or we think that the 5 are the only ones who trimmed their wicks. Everybody fell asleep, everybody trimmed their wicks, but only one group had oil left over because they were in the abundance cycle, not the disobedience cycle. Okay, so what's the bride's responsibility during this season? Obviously, A, to consume. She now has this newfound inheritance, dowry, as it were, however you want to put it. And it's time for her to start acting like a bride. So she's going to get the things that she wants. She's going to prepare herself, of course. But in that process, she's actually going to take upon herself the blessing that comes from being the bride to be, right? And so she's going to not exploit her purpose, but she's going to walk out her purpose. Now we get into some heavy duty stuff when we start to think about that each individual has their own path, which means your Holy Spirit is not my Holy Spirit. Your God is not my God, right? And so in that way, what we need to understand is that each individual's experience with their Creator is theirs. And we cannot dishonor that with fundamentalist, dogmatic hogwash. We have to allow the divine to operate in each individual individually. Which means my experience with God may not be your experience with God. That's why we could go, how come Moses' face got to glow? Well, if he wants your face to glow, it'll happen. But you know what? I'm going to tell you right now, it might not, because he was what? A fingerprint. Unique. throughout the history of reality, different from everybody else. His experience was his experience. Your experience is your experience. The relevance is going to come in the sense of understanding of that prescribed path. It will be illuminated. You will know exactly what you are supposed to do as a result of an extraordinary amount of synchronicities. What people would call coincidences is actually the intensification of all power in the universe speaking to you, describing your purpose, prescribing your purpose. So the Spirit himself is actually giving what? Ability or willfulness to the bride to begin the path of bridehood that will be consummated at the fall feast, that will be consummated at tabernacles, but also creates a new liberation from what? From the order, but also creates what? An opportunity for her to step into the responsibility, the ability to respond to the things around her differently. Okay? I will tell you that a prescribed path also means that you can't go where you went before. There's a newness to this thing. Just like there's a birthing that occurs at Pentecost. It says Israel became a nation overnight. Israel became a bride overnight. Okay? And so when we start to understand the function of a prescribed path in the sense of Pentecost, then we also understand that as we step into that purpose, we cannot afford to squander it. Or we may repeat this season again until we get it. Or it's very possible, depending on how opposite our understanding is compared to what we should be doing, we may cancel it. I'm sure there are many purposes that you have had in your life that you never actually stepped into, many abundances that would have accompanied that, many opportunities to heal someone else or to give something to someone else. Keep in mind one other important fact. That that prescribed path is not malevolent, which means what? It is full of benevolent energies, which means it contains abundance, it contains love, it contains healing, and those are fruits that will manifest in your life as you sow them. Those are things that you will reap as you sow them. A prescribed path creates a new opportunity for blessing and abundance, but also is purpose. So now I think you understand how the Ruach played a role, or the Spirit played a role in Pentecost, which means part of independence is being enabled by the essence of life, right? The Ruach, to accomplish that purpose. Now we can understand where there's this idea of a quenching of the Spirit. Like that you can really, truly, actually prevent that abundance from serving its purpose in your life, where you can prevent that purpose from existing in your life, where you can prevent that prescribed path from even being an option in your process, in your walk. Remember that Hasatan is actually the opposition of that prescribed path. Meaning what? Meaning whatever it is that resists that prescribed path is Satan. Well, I propose to you that there's no actual external entity trying to prevent you from your purpose except for you. Because once you start going down it, you're enabled, which means that can't be possible. An opposition can't be possible. And I have observed this enough in my life that I can tell you that it is absolutely true. Now, I'm just one person testifying. We need other witnesses for sure. Maybe that comes out in Midrash. But I can tell you, and I can warn you, that you are actually the one who will interfere with that prescribed path. Or you will actually execute it, make it a reality. It will come into conformity of your will. Okay? Because it's time for the bride to have willfulness again. There's a time where she's moving into order, and then there's a breaking forth again. And that breaking forth is a new flushing, a new cycle, a new space being created for new life. Okay? All right. For those of you who are on YouTube, we'll just go ahead and say Shabbat Shalom. And I hope that you guys got something out of this and enjoyed it, and have an opportunity to maybe put some comments. I will check the comments probably on Monday. But you guys have an amazing rest of your Shabbat. I will say Shabbat Shalom, and then go ahead and end this